Simpson with Empowering Business Inc. I'm sitting with Jeffrey Cullen this morning. He is a business broker. And Jeff, how about you introduce yourself?
Sounds good. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast, Linda. It's really exciting to be here. My name is Jeff Cullen. I've been a business broker with Sunbelt Business Brokers here in Edmonton for about 9 months, coming off of about a 20 some odd year career as a self-employed management consultant, where near the end of that, in the middle and then at the end, I did a lot of work around exit planning, which then obviously led, to the being somewhat on a different part of that spectrum of the process of getting an owner out of their business. We used to sort of do the coaching part, and now I do the sales part. So I have a pretty good view of the whole process.
Now, I recently sold my business and I worked with Sunbelt. I worked with one of your colleagues, and I found it quite an interesting process. Can you just highlight maybe 2 or 3 things that you think a business owner, should know or look at before they even approach talking to a broker like yourself?
Sure. So I would say the first thing that they got to be sure about what they want to do. So, there's a real pathway to exiting a business. And I think a lot of people think it's something that can be done kind of abruptly. And on some, unfortunately, in some circumstances, it has to be. But if somebody has time to prepare, really having those thoughts and those sort of discussions with trusted family members, and do you want to sell the business? Do you want to pass it on to the employees? Do you want to, maybe you just want to shut the door and walk away? So the more certain someone is, they don't have to be 100% sure, but have at least entertained those aspects so that when we start going through the process, there's alignment. It's I think that brings a lot of value.
Okay. And I know in our case, we had multiple years of very firm financial information that we could provide to the broker. So
Yeah.
I assume that made your jobs way easier, that you could come up with a price, an estimated price, and that. So having properly prepared financial documents multiple years would be important. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So again, and I know you used to be an accountant, so making your accountant your friend, and that's one of the people that should definitely be on the trusted advisor list, right? So having that sit down with the accountant, because there may be things where there's some recasting to be done, or there may be tax implications. And again, we don't necessarily get into that, as brokers. We have a pretty narrow scope of what we do, but we're aware that there's a lot of steps. And then sometimes we'll have to turn someone away in terms of readiness, or there may be some downstream implications on the tax front that, could have been better positioned. So I would say, not only do you want good financials, really important, but having looked with the accountant at what are the implications, I guess it goes back to what I said about kind of knowing what you want, right? If you want to do a share sale, right, talk to your accountant, look at the tax, look at estate questions, holdcos, all of that kind of stuff, and there's a timeline that needs to be, kept in mind. Again, it's always time is your friend, and being too abrupt is not necessarily good. So yeah, that'd be another aspect for sure.
And if I was thinking about selling my business and I came to a broker, am I looking at a few months, a few years? Like, is there kind of a guideline of how long it would take?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So a general guideline, we typically will say 9 to 12 months to sell is the average. I know the gentleman that sort of runs the brokerage in Edmonton, his record, I think he's quite proud of, his 47 days, but that was a fluke, right? That just happens to be the right person came along at the right time. I think a lot of people have again, a perception that this will be a couple of months and, they'll be out, and everything takes, a lot longer. And so 9 to 12 months is probably a reasonable timeline in your mind. But again, it could take longer, right? And then even once the process starts, it's still not something that necessarily happens fast, right? There's a lot of sequential steps, a lot of back and forth. And I think sometimes people get frustrated and maybe a little bit of deal fatigue. And so again, we try to prepare people, and honestly ourselves as well, because we it's exciting when the deal goes through and moves forward, and to not get sort of too agitated if things stall out or it takes longer. We're dealing with lawyers, accountants, and for us and the buyer and the seller, this is the most important thing in the world. For some of these other professionals, honestly, they've got a lot of other clients and files, and that sense of urgency may not be quite as acute for them as it is for us. So it's patience, it's being realistic really helps in the process.
So being that I was an accountant, I kind of knew what a business broker did,
Right.
But I don't think the average person knows what a business broker does. So would you like to expound on that a little for us?
Sure, I'd love to take us through the broad strokes. So a business broker is a little bit like a real estate agent, a little bit. I mean, that's probably the most common reference point. So our role is to be sort of the facilitator, the intermediary between a buyer and a seller. And so it starts with the seller. When we bring someone on, obviously, we start with a conversation about the business. We want to find out as much as we can what the business is about, how long it's been around, how many people own it, those kind of dynamics. Then we take a look at financials. And also an important question we always have is, why do you want to sell this business, right? Do you really want to sell it? And do you want to sell it because there's a health issue? Perhaps the owner feels they've sort of hit their plateau in terms of being able to grow it. There's whatever reason. Of course, we never judge that, but it helps us to understand the mentality. Once we have that initial sort of discovery done, then if somebody lists with us, we have a listing agreement. The first thing we do is we come up with we call it a most probable selling price. So again, as an accountant, valuations are done for a variety of reasons. There are specialist business valuators, CBVs. We are not CBVs, and we don't do a valuation that would stand up in court or would be used for like like a dispute under a unanimous shareholders agreement, or those are all sort of very definitive. We look at it again the way a realtor would come in and look at your house and say, okay, I know the average in the neighborhood is X, but this particular house with this particular, kind of kitchen and these features, based on our experience, it's going to sell for this. So we kind of do the same thing. We have a very defined methodology of looking at the financial performance. We try to take out certain things that maybe are unique to that business, how it operated, that a new buyer, so like one of them, oftentimes maybe somebody's running some of their personal hobbies through the business, like nobody wants to admit that, but all of us are business owners, and we know, you do those things. I don't think it's unethical. It's part of it. Well, the next owner may not have that hobby, right? So we would take those things out. We call it normalizing or recasting, so that it is the most generic it can be, and often that will change the bottom line. So we go through that process. We then look at a number of other factors. We have access to lots of databases of what businesses have sold for and where the market, and then we triangulate. We come back with what we think is the most likely selling price for that business at this time in the market that the business is in. Sometimes owners like that number, sometimes they don't. And again, our position is the market doesn't really care, what you think the business is worth. In fact, we often go out of our way to not get an impression from the owner. If someone comes in and I want to sell it for this, like, like I don't want to know. I want to be able to look at this objectively and then provide, the seller with that objective number, right? Don't want to be necessarily influenced by their impression. Everybody thinks their business is worth, more than, most people, I should say, thinks it's worth more than it is, because it's their baby and they love it. And, why wouldn't anybody else think it's wonderful? Well, part of our role is to take that buyer's position as an objective outsider and goes, I don't really have a relationship with your business, so I'm looking at it much more dispassionately, right? So facilitating that. Once we agree on that number, then we take the business to market. Again, most brokers have infrastructure in place, through the internet, social media, big network, where you can basically advertise the business, always with confidentiality foremost, right? So we word things and we couch things so that nobody really can determine who the business is. We don't want employees or customers or vendors to get nervous until the owner is ready to release that information in a controlled way. So we put a lot of our efforts in anonymity. The business then gets out to this network of buyers. We have our own internal network, Sunbelt Canada, Sunbelt Global. And there's a whole bunch of these sort of aggregator websites that also pull listings from all the brokers and list them as well. So we go out. That would be the passive side. We will also then actively market the business. So if it's in a particular industry, and again, this is something that we'll negotiate and discuss with the sellers. Sometimes they'll say, I don't want you approaching people, in this geographic area because my business is so unique. As soon as you say X, someone's going to know, So we come up with a strategy, and it could be approaching adjacent businesses. Maybe it would be attractive to somebody who is a vendor, or somewhere in the value chain. Whatever we come up with, we'll actively go out and just solicit and say, hey, we have a business in your industry or whatever, are you interested in maybe looking at it? Big part of what we do for a seller as well is we're sort of that filter between about 98% of the people who approach us are not going to buy the business. We have stats that brokers have kept. It's about 2% of the people who come looking will actually buy. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but a lot of them are curious. We call them dreamers, tire kickers, looky-loos, right? And again, part of our job is to eliminate as many of those people as possible so that we're not wasting a seller's time. We would never bring someone that we haven't triaged a little bit, and we want to make sure they have sufficient funds to be a serious buyer. We'll have conversations with them about their level of experience, what they're looking for, because bringing a first-time buyer to a more complex business is probably not a good fit. So sometimes they may come looking at business X, and after we've talked to them, we might say, well, maybe something that's a little bit more hands-on or a little bit more, we're careful with our words, but a starter business, if you will. Maybe that would be more appropriate, buy this one, something like this, get into the business, learn, and then in a few years, if you're successful, you can sell that one and then go after something bigger, so it's those stages. Once we have a buyer, we then will facilitate, we think might be serious, we'll then facilitate a discussion usually with the seller, again, maintaining confidentiality. People have to sign non-disclosures, and if the seller is willing to meet, we'll then facilitate often an in-person meeting. And most of the time, that's our job there, is to just be quiet and let them talk and just to listen first. There's certain things we don't want people to disclose, maybe out of enthusiasm. I know you mentioned one of my colleagues, he had a case where the seller got a little excited and said something that he probably shouldn't have said about what, kind of what his bottom line was. Well, the buyer took that information and, even though the business was listed higher, guess what the offer was? That guy said he's happy with X, that's what I'm offering. So, we want to avoid those kind of premature showing of cards, so that again is part of our job. At that point, a buyer would make an offer, right? So again, we would help facilitate the written offer. Sometimes their lawyer wants to do their own format. Again, we try to support that. And then once an offer is on the table, then there's a whole process by which over like 45 days, there's a bunch of milestones. So the seller accepts the offer, deposit, then we go into due diligence, which is where we get to answer a lot of buyer questions. I like to refer to due diligence as it's kind of like a colonoscopy, but not nearly as much fun, right? I don't think anybody enjoys it. Certainly the sellers don't. And again, part of our job is to prepare our sellers for the reality of that. There's going to be questions, and if there's things that are not questionable, but perhaps a little bit that need to be disclosed, we need to have all of that on the table. Better to have a deal fall apart than to try to spin things and then it have on the back end be problematic.
Right.
Ultimately, then once we get through due diligence, we turn it over to the lawyers, and again, it gets hammered out, and hopefully, as you went through, it works, and a check is written and everybody's happy. I mean, that's our goal. We want the sellers to be happy. We want the buyers to be happy. We want everybody to walk away from that experience feeling like it was a successful, endeavor. People got treated fairly and they got what they wanted, and everybody is satisfied. Maybe happy is a bit, too much to ask for, but it's certainly what we shoot for. But if people can say, I'm satisfied with how it went, I think that we've been successful.
I know in our case, we sold our baby and it was difficult at times. And I have to say that one thing that made it much easier was having Sunbelt and Kevin involved in the process. Because whenever we kind of go, oh, they're asking for more information, you just kind of walk us through it and say, well, they've asked for this,
Right.
At one point we lived in the Arctic and I had to sell a house with no salesperson or anything.
Okay.
That is really tough to do. I cannot imagine trying to sell a business without using a broker. It's just, how do you negotiate? How do you set that price? All of that. So I would highly, highly recommend that people use a broker to sell.
It's funny because even when I would facilitate even internal successions. Years ago, I used to work through the business development bank, not for them, but I was an independent consultant. And, it's never the money. At the end of the day, we can always agree on money and terms. It's always the emotional side that is the issue. And I think our job is to be that buffer, but in some cases, it's almost like a translation interpretation role, right? And I think you hit on it. It's like, well, why would they ask that, right? And I think a lot of deals, when people don't have that objective third party, probably fall apart because people get their backup, right? So the buyer's asking a question, presumably in good faith. The seller, maybe there's some emotional issue, and then it becomes personal, right? Like, are you accusing me of whatever? And our role is to be that go-between and say, first of all, maybe just to calm things down. Okay, that question is it stings a little, and I can understand why you're uncomfortable. Let's just take a minute to breathe through it, and then catch our breath, and then let's just work through and depersonalize it, because we don't have a personal stake in it, and we can be, I think, as you pointed, like Kevin was doing, they want more, and then he could sort of explain from their perspective, blah 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 blah, because it's two parties who really don't have much in common necessarily, and it's an emotional issue, and money's involved, and how dare you question what I've done for 25 years? Okay, well, yeah, you gotta understand the buyer has no history of your business, right? They're looking at it very objectively, and they need to have that comfort level. So let's just try to work together.
And I want to say that in our case, we're in a very small town. The buyer didn't even know our location until almost all of the deals had been hammered out. They knew kind of where we were, but
Right.
keeping that confidentiality for us was huge because, of
Sure.
course, we're in a service business. And if anybody knew we were thinking about selling, it could really affect, if we didn't go through with the sale, it could affect our long-term and longevity just all on its own, right? So,
Oh yeah, so that becomes a bit of a chicken and egg thing, right?
Yeah.
Because the business is valued potentially as it's operating, and then as you say, if word gets out and then suddenly people start abandoning ship, or and people are funny, right? Like they don't like change, and that's why we often, well, almost always will recommend, because sometimes sellers will ask us, should I tell my staff? And it's always like, you know what? There's a long road here. There's really no point in telling people before it's a done deal or almost a done deal. Occasionally, maybe a few like highly trusted, top people need to be brought in, because for instance, once due diligence starts, sometimes the owner can't answer certain questions, right? They need their accountant or their office manager to be sort of in the loop. But again, that's very carefully curated so that it doesn't cause that panic. And sometimes, to my experience, hearing what the employees, their response to it, and again, an owner who thinks they're just going to sell and introduce the new owner, there's a new owner, good luck, that doesn't usually work. There needs to be that maintenance of trust with the existing employees, and that the fact, that their concerns are kind of listened to, heard, and perhaps communicated to the new buyer. And it's not always money. Like there are sellers who really want to understand what's the relationship going to be, in terms of the culture, and may decide, you know what, I don't think this is the right buyer. I think they're going to come in, and you can never be 100% sure, but a lot of this is on gut, and just think, I don't think it's going to work. I had one gentleman I talked to said, they had started a deal. This is long before I joined Sunbelt, and he didn't like the way the guy spoke to one of his vendors, right? He thought the guy was rude or short or whatever, and he killed the deal. And he said, I've built this business. It's all relationships. And I just, despite the fact that the guy was willing to pay, market price, I didn't want to turn it over to someone that I just had this undermine those relationships, right? And the reputation of the company. So he didn't sell it, so yeah, it's important. All those aspects are really important.
Jeff, I could talk to you all day about this. I'm kind of passionate about business, and so are you. Would you come back and we can carry on this conversation another time?
I would be happy to do that. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and I will get your contact information so we can add it to our podcast.
That would be wonderful. And, I'm so honored to have been a guest. And yeah, definitely look forward to, collaborating and doing more. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Linda. Take care.